They poured the wine, lifted their glasses, and told me straight out that I wasn't going to be in charge of my own money anymore. Before we begin, make sure to like and subscribe, and please tell me and others what's one life lesson everyone should hear before it's too late. Share it in the comments below. Thanks. My own children. They said it was for my own good. What they didn't realize was that just a few hours earlier, I'd signed the last papers for a healthcare business that's now worth over $150 million. I didn't even blink. I just sat there and waited for my phone to start ringing. And sure enough, it did. Over and over, about 50 calls in a row. Everyone at the table went quiet. No one could have guessed what was coming next. Before I get into it, let me introduce myself. I'm Darlene Travis. I'm 56 years old, and right up until my son looked me in the eye and said I was being cut off, I honestly thought the most uncomfortable moment of the evening was going to be when Lucas told that long, boring story about his neighbor's divorce lawyer. We were at his house. Lucas lives in one of those huge Connecticut mansions where the front hall is bigger than most people's entire homes. His wife, Christine, had hired a new decorator who seemed to think everyone wants to eat dinner under a giant painting of a horse. I had parked my old, sensible car behind Spencer's flashy SUV and Emily's shiny Tesla. Even though I got there first, no one noticed, or maybe they just didn't care. That's how it usually goes in our family. You're either the one talking about yourself or you're just sitting there, listening. I've always been the one listening. The house smelled like fancy candles and lemon cleaner. Christine gave me a quick kiss on the cheek, the kind that barely touches you, while she held out a tray of tiny crab cakes. She made sure to say they were gluten-free and flown in from some special shop in Maine that only sells to restaurants. Everyone else was already in the big dining room, the one they hardly ever use. Lucas sat at the head of the table like he was about to run a meeting. Emily was drinking something from a glass that probably cost more than my whole set of plates. And Spencer was glued to his phone under the table, pretending he wasn't. Nobody asked me how I was doing. They never do. Dinner started the same way it always does. Lucas talking about the stock market like he's the only person who watches the news. Emily trying to sound humble about a case she'd won, and Spencer reminding us he's an influencer even, though none of us really know what that means. I smiled politely, cut my asparagus into small bites, and waited for the moment when someone would crack a joke at my expense. It didn't take long. Emily asked if I was still tutoring, like I hadn't already told them 3 times I stopped last year. Lucas made a comment about how peaceful retirement must be and said maybe I was spending more time with the ladies who lunch. Spencer laughed way too loudly. I just smiled and let it all pass. I've learned it's easier not to correct people when they've already decided what to think about you. Then Lucas cleared his throat, which in our family is like hitting a big red alarm button. He set down his wine glass and said, "Mom, we wanted to talk to you about something important." I froze with my fork halfway to my mouth. Emily adjusted her napkin like she was about to hit turbulence on a plane. Spencer sat up taller, trying to look serious. Lucas went on, sounding like he'd practiced this speech in the mirror. "We've been talking, and we think it's time to make some changes with the family trust." My stomach turned over. I didn't even realize I was still part of the family trust. I hadn't touched a penny from it in years. But the way he said it, all calm and polished, made my heart twist. Emily jumped in, saying it would be healthier for me if they handled my money from now on. She said there was too much risk in me having my own access, and that I'd had a rough couple of years. I tried to answer, but Spencer cut me off, like he was delivering some kind of gift. "We're not leaving you on your own, Mom. It's just simpler this way. Less stress for you, you know." I nodded slowly, pretending to chew, though I couldn't really feel my tongue anymore. The mashed potatoes felt like they weighed 100 pounds. "So," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "you're cutting me off." No. Lucas rushed to say we're just centralizing things. For efficiency. I let out a short laugh, the kind that sounds like a bark, and took a sip of water so I wouldn't pick up a dinner roll and throw it at his head. That's when my phone started buzzing. I ignored it at first, then it kept buzzing, again and again, fast as a racing heartbeat. I reached down, pulled it out of my bag, and looked at the screen. 50 missed calls, 49 voicemails, all from the same group of people: my engineers, my staff, my assistant, and the team leader for our hospital project. One name popped up: Lacey. I stood up from the table, mumbled something no one really heard, and stepped into the hallway. I answered quietly, "Hey, what's going on?" I turned a little to the side but stayed close enough that my kids could hear me. "Darlene," Lacey said, sounding out of breath, "it's official. We just got the word the valuation is in. We're at 150 million before the IPO. You did it." I didn't say a word at first. Over at the table, no one else spoke either. Everyone was trying to figure out what was happening. I turned back around, still holding the phone, and looked right at Lucas. "You were saying something about not trusting me with money," I asked calmly. Lucas blinked like he was trying to clear his vision. Emily froze with her fork halfway to her mouth. Spencer was so shocked he dropped his phone on the plate. I slipped my phone into my purse, smoothed my napkin, and said, "I'll be staying at the cottage for the rest of the month unless that's also been centralized without asking me." Then I picked up my fork and finished my asparagus. No one said a word. For the first time in years, they were completely speechless. I let them sit in that quiet. The thing people never really understand about grief is how silent it is. It's not all crying into your pillow or yelling at the sky like in the movies. It's the stillness. It's forgetting what you were about to say because a smell reminded you of someone you lost. It's walking past the coffee filters at the store and suddenly crying because you remembered you're the only one left to use them. When Henry died, the kids all posted tributes on Instagram and gave long speeches at the funeral. Then, they went straight back to their busy lives. Lucas flew back to work 2 days later. Emily had a big case to handle. Spencer did some live video from the airport. I stayed behind, surrounded by casseroles from neighbors and a loneliness so deep it felt like it pressed against my skin. Henry and I were married 31 years. He was steady, funny, in a dry way, always the smartest person in the room but never needed to prove it. He called me Teach, even after I'd retired. I thought once the meals stopped showing up and the text messages slowed down, I'd just drift along. What I didn't expect was to find that folder in his desk. Just a plain, beat-up manila envelope, with Vets First written on the front in Henry's neat handwriting. Inside were old sketches and notes clippings about how long veterans waited for care at the VA, articles about the suicide rates among veterans who got stuck in the system. In the middle, there was a rough outline for some kind of software. The idea was simple: match patients to the right doctors faster, flag urgent cases so nobody fell through the cracks. It wasn't technical, just thoughts. But for the first time, I could see how serious he'd been about making something that mattered. Henry wasn't a tech person. He'd spent his life managing hospital paperwork and rules, but maybe after he got sick, something inside him clicked. Maybe he felt guilty about the system or regretted not fixing it sooner. That night, I sat on the kitchen floor in my bathrobe with a glass of wine, reading every single page twice. Then I opened my laptop and started searching online. I didn't really know what I was doing. All I knew was I had to try. Starting a business, especially a tech one, should have felt impossible. I'd never run a company. I didn't even know what an accelerator was, but I knew how to learn. I'd spent 30 years teaching high school kids how to dissect frogs and write lab reports. I could teach myself this, too. So I began slowly. I went to free classes at the community center. I watched endless videos about health startups. I joined online groups full of young founders who said things like pivot and burn rate, like it was everyday talk. I didn't say much. I just listened and took notes. Later, I used a small part of Henry's life insurance, the part the kids didn't know about because he kept it separate, and I hired a freelance developer I found online. Her name was Lacey. She was 25, smart as a whip, and a little suspicious until I explained the idea. "This usually turns into something that never really works," she told me, "or it gets bought up by a big company and buried." I promised her that wouldn't happen. Not if we kept it quiet. Not if we built it the right way. We started working in my kitchen. The garage still had Henry's tools. I turned it into an office. I bought a whiteboard and kept the coffee pot running from 7 in the morning until 11 at night. Lacey came over 3 times a week. The rest of the time, she worked from home. After a while, we brought in another coder, her friend Javier, who was great with the behind-the-scenes parts of the software. Then we added Sonia, a designer who said the program looked like a tax form married to a hospital bill. She fixed it so it was clean and easy to use. We weren't fast, we weren't flashy, but we were determined. I didn't tell the kids if I had They would have asked 1,000 questions or, worse, laughed it off. I let them think I was spending my days knitting and watching true crime shows. When they called, I'd step outside so they wouldn't hear the team talking on Zoom or the markers squeaking on the whiteboard. It wasn't that I was ashamed, I just knew the second they got involved, it would stop being about Henry's dream and start being about them taking control. The turning point was when we had our first real meeting with a clinic director. It was a veterans care center upstate. They were drowning in paperwork and delays. The administrator, a guy named Frank, agreed to give our system a shot. If it doesn't blow up my calendar, he said, we'll think about a trial. 2 weeks later, their wait list dropped by 30%. 3 weeks in, they were calling to ask when they could get more features. Lacey cried when the feedback came in. I just stared at the screen, thinking, it's real now. That night, I found one of Henry's old mugs in the dishwasher. The one that said "World's Okay Husband." I poured myself some tea and drank from it like a little toast to him. After that first trial at the Veterans Clinic, things only sped up. After that, everything shifted into this kind of quiet chaos that became my new normal. Most mornings started the same way. I'd have my coffee at 6, join a Zoom call with the team by 7, then take a long walk around the block. I'd pretend I was just another retired lady out for exercise in case any neighbors were watching. After that, I'd slip back inside, to work filling out grant forms, reaching out to clinics, or trying to explain HIPAA rules to a 27-year-old designer who had only ever built shopping apps. I kept my schedule simple and my excuses ready. Yoga on Mondays, grief group on Thursdays, book club whenever someone asked why I wasn't picking up their calls. The truth was, I hadn't opened a novel in months. The only club I belonged to was an online forum for startup founders, where people tossed around acronyms like CAC and MRR, as if they were talking about the weather. I didn't always get what they meant, but I was learning fast. Funny enough, being away from my kids actually helped. From a distance, they could keep judging me, assuming I spent my days baking casseroles and going to matinees. That gave me cover to do what I was really doing. I told them as little as possible, not because I didn't want them to be proud, but because I already knew exactly how that talk would go. Lucas would interrupt to ask about my monetization strategy before I could finish a sentence. Emily would jump in with legal advice I hadn't asked for. Spencer would crack some joke about me being the next Zuckerberg, then ask if I could get him verified on LinkedIn. So I kept it to myself. And for the first time in years, I wasn't living in someone else's idea of who I should be. 2 months later, we got our second pilot, Clinica's small outpatient center in Tulsa. They'd heard about us at a veterans health conference, thanks to someone on our team who'd slipped in with a fake badge and a big smile. The results were even better than before. Turns out, when you give burned-out clinic staff a tool that actually helps, they don't care who built it or whether you're running it from your garage, they just want it to work. That's when the calls started. Not a flood, but a steady trickle. People asked, "How soon can we try it? Does it work with our system? Are you really running this out of your house?" I said yes to all three and decided we'd figure the rest out as we went. At night, I'd read through Henry's old notes again, now covered in my own scribbles and ideas. It felt like an unfinished conversation between us, one that kept moving forward. I never thought about giving up control, not once. Not even when an early investor, who we met through Lacey, offered to buy the whole thing for a fat paycheck. He grinned like I should be falling over with gratitude. I smiled right back and told him we weren't looking for shortcuts. Not with something this important. It was funny, the more progress we made, the more invisible I became in the rest of my life. That Christmas, I flew to Emily's place in DC. I spent the whole weekend listening to her fiancé explain his platform for bipartisan dialogue. While I passed him the mashed potatoes, nobody asked what I was working on. Nobody noticed when I left early. At one point, Spencer pulled me aside and said, "You should really get out more. Mom, take a cruise or something. You've earned it." I almost laughed. I was working 80 hours a week and hadn't taken a real day off in 6 months. But I just nodded and told him I'd think about it. Meanwhile, I was interviewing new hires, reworking our onboarding guides, and trying to figure out how to pitch hospital directors without sounding like I'd lost my mind. I wasn't trying to be some big-shot CEO. I just didn't trust anyone else to protect what we were building. Somewhere along the way, the team started calling me Miss D, half respect, half inside joke, but always said with affection. I wasn't the name on the website, but I was the person they called when the server went down or when a clinic threatened to back out over a small glitch. I learned how to stay calm on Zoom, even when my heart was thumping so hard I had to secretly Google tech terms in another window. I learned how to lead without being the loudest person in the room. I even learned to enjoy the messy, exhausting process of building something from scratch. But the only reason any of it worked was because I kept it completely separate. My team didn't know about my family, and my family didn't know about the team. It was like living in two different worlds, with me in the middle, juggling little fibs that eventually stopped feeling like lies. When Lucas asked how I was paying for my splurges, which was really just my new fridge, I told him I was finally dipping into Henry's old life insurance, which was technically true. When Emily asked if I'd thought about selling the house, I said I was considering it, even though I wasn't. When Spencer asked if I was dating anyone, I said I was seeing someone boring and normal, just to shut him up. The truth was, I didn't have time for dating or real estate or family drama. I had a mission, a small, scrappy team that believed in it, and this little flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, we were actually going to make it. I didn't know when the truth would finally come out. I just knew that when it did, I wanted to be able to look at every line of code, every grateful email from a clinic, and every tired face in our Slack channels, and feel certain that I'd done it right, quietly, thoroughly, my way. There's always that one moment in any big project when everything feels shaky, like it could either fall apart completely or finally start working. For us, that moment came about 9 months in. The clinic in Tulsa liked what we were doing so much, they told a bigger healthcare network about us. This network helped both veterans and low-income patients across 4 different states. They didn't have much technology in place, which made them perfect for us. Their staff was exhausted, always getting calls to reschedule appointments. They were desperate for something that could make their lives easier. Lacey and Javier spent 3 nights in a row, barely sleeping, trying to tweak our software so it would work with their old systems. While they were doing that, I answered every email like we were already a huge company, instead of just 4 people running everything out of my garage. I remember one night, around 3 a.m., I was sitting on a plastic milk crate, eating saltine crackers for dinner. Sonia was explaining why our welcome screens needed to use kinder words, because not everyone has the patience of a young tech guy who lives on energy drinks. I was so tired I could hardly think straight. I just nodded and mumbled something about empathy being a design principle, which made her laugh so hard she accidentally deleted a layer she'd been working on for 2 hours. That week was when I knew we were really doing this. It wasn't just a hobby or a way to feel useful. It had become a real system. Clinics were calling us on purpose. Patients were finally getting appointments sooner. Even the case managers, who usually treated new software like it was some awful chore, were starting to say good things. We weren't just being tolerated, we were being trusted. That same week, we finally got solid proof. The numbers showed a 58% drop in wait times, a 40% drop in no-shows, and over 600 patients matched with doctors in the first month. I printed out the results and pinned them above the garage fridge, right next to Henry's old service medal. I never explained why I kept that medal there. No one asked, but every time I walked past it, I thought about Henry telling me once how he wished he could do more for his old army buddies, the ones who came home and got lost in the cracks. And now, somehow, we were catching some of those cracks before they swallowed people up. Still, if you'd looked in the garage window, nothing about it looked impressive. You'd see a tired woman in sweatpants squinting at spreadsheets, while 3 20-somethings argued about where to put a login button. There was no fancy office, no investors, no glossy magazine articles, just long hours, a lot of caffeine, and one big idea: make the system a little less awful for the people who needed it most. Around that time, Lacey pulled me aside. She said, "Look, I know you're paying for all this yourself, but we're going to hit a wall soon. Infrastructure costs are real. You need a runway." I nodded like it wasn't news to me, even though I already knew our cloud bills were doubling and our compliance consultant was hinting she'd have to raise her rates. Lacey was right. We were growing fast, but we were also bleeding money. For the next 3 days, I combed through every grant I could find. I even applied for one from a nonprofit Henry used to give to, back when we had more money than time. Filled out the application with shaking hands, reread it 3 times, and finally shut my laptop. I told myself I'd take a quick walk. but that turned into a drive, which turned into me sitting in the grocery store parking lot, crying into a crumpled napkin because I realized I hadn't eaten lunch and couldn't remember what day it was. That's when the email came in. We'd been accepted into a state-funded pilot program, $250,000 in seed funding for 6 months, with a chance for more if we did well. I stared at the screen so long I forgot to breathe. Then, I called Lacey and told her. She screamed so loud I dropped the phone. It wasn't just the money, though of course we needed it. It was the feeling that someone out there, someone who didn't owe us anything, looked at what we were doing and said, yes, this matters. That night I ordered real takeout instead of heating up another frozen meal. And for the first time in months, I let myself relax. I didn't tell the kids, not even when Lucas called that weekend pretending to check in, but really wanting to know if I'd thought about selling the house. I told him I was fine. I even said I was thinking about refinancing, which was technically true since I needed money to upgrade our servers again. He told me I should talk to a financial advisor, someone objective, which was Lucas speak for someone who would tell me to hand over control of everything I still owned. I thanked him for the advice and made a mental note to change my passwords. What I didn't tell him anyone, was that I'd just signed a lease on a tiny office space. It was barely big enough for 5 people. The carpet was peeling, and the coffee machine looked like it hadn't been cleaned since the 90s, but it had windows. It had a door I could lock, and it had a little plaque slot by the entrance. For the first time, I wrote something to put there. Not the company's name. We still hadn't picked one that didn't sound like a vitamin supplement but mine. Darlene Travis, founder. I stood there and looked at it for a long time, letting it really sink in. I'd built something, not just a piece of software, a team, a purpose, a real chance to change a part of the world everyone else had given up on, and maybe, just maybe this time, I wouldn't have to give it up. I wasn't the only one who still believed in doing things the hard way quietly, without asking for permission first. We'd just settled into our new little office when I started to feel something change. Not in the business that was going better than I ever imagined, but in the background hum of my life, the part that had to do with my kids and all the stories they'd made up about who I was. It all started with a small comment from Lucas. We were on a family call about refinancing, and he casually mentioned a flagged transaction he'd noticed while he was looking at some shared tax papers from Henry's estate. He acted like it was no big deal. I pretended to be confused and told him I'd check it out. But the minute we hung up, I spent an hour deleting financial bookmarks and double-checking my secure email. I wasn't hiding anything illegal. I was just using my part of Henry's old life insurance, the money nobody ever touched, to help build this healthcare platform. The rest of the family didn't even know it existed, which to them probably felt like a crime. A week later, the tension got worse. A bank representative called me. She sounded polite, but her voice was firm. She wanted to confirm a wire transfer I'd sent to a medical data vendor. I knew right away it wasn't some random check. My name doesn't get picked by accident. Someone had flagged it. Probably Lucas, maybe Emily, definitely not Spencer. Can barely keep track of his own Venmo. I felt this hot ache in my chest. Not exactly fear, but that awful mix of hurt and the sad feeling you get when you realize you're being watched by people who don't trust you. Maybe they never did. At our next check-in, Lacey noticed I was distracted and asked if something was wrong. I told her that someone in my family might be snooping around our finances. She nodded like it was nothing new. Founders and families rarely mix well, she said. She was typing with one hand and drinking from a big thermos that said, "Nope juice, want me to lock down the account privacy?" I told her yes, and to make sure anything about my personal spending stayed off the shared servers. Later that night, I went home and pulled out the old metal box where I'd kept our marriage certificate, the insurance papers, and Henry's sketches. I flipped through them slowly, thinking about what he would have said if he could see this, his wife, basically being audited by her own kids. He probably would have laughed and told me to build a firewall around my heart. He was always good with metaphors. 2 days later, I got a letter. It came in a stiff, official-looking envelope with my full name on the front, sent by certified mail. Inside was a document written in polite language, asking for a financial oversight review. All 3 of my children had signed it. They said they were worried about my long-term solvency and my mental stress after losing Henry. I sat on the porch steps reading it, the sunlight catching the gold notary stamp like it was trying to rub it in. They hadn't even called first, they just sent paperwork. like I was some distant old aunt who couldn't be trusted to handle her own money. I didn't cry. I didn't even swear. I just went inside, made a cup of tea, and read it again. This time with a pen so I could circle all the little phrases that stung: voluntary reassignment of fiduciary guidance, limitation of disbursement, authority. Then I pulled out my own binder, the one I'd been putting together all year. It was full of signed contracts, funding approvals, outcome reports, and the provisional patent I'd filed in my name. It wasn't just receipts, it was proof. That night, I didn't sleep. Not because I was scared of losing control, but because it finally hit me how little my own kids thought of me. They'd gone this far taking legal steps behind my back because, in their eyes, I was still the woman who once burned a casserole and cried when Henry forgot our anniversary, not the person quietly building something real, something they couldn't even imagine. The next morning, I called a lawyer. Not the family lawyer someone Lacey recommended. She was young, sharp as a tack, and didn't bother sugarcoating anything. She read the letter and raised her eyebrows. "This is preemptive control dressed up as concern," she said. "We can shut this down easily, but you need to start documenting everything, every cent, every email, every call." So I did. I spent the next 3 days scanning receipts, recording phone calls, and making a detailed timeline of how the platform started. I even included little things, like the $38 I spent on frozen pizzas when the team stayed up all night before our first pilot launch. At one point, I caught myself writing a note to Henry in the margins, like he could read it. "This is what legacy looks like now, huh?" I didn't reply to the letter. I let it sit there and let them wonder what I was thinking. At our next family Zoom, I smiled politely and pretended nothing was wrong. Lucas asked again if I'd thought about consolidating my accounts, and I said I'd been meaning to get around to it. Emily offered to recommend a firm that specializes in elder asset protection, which made me laugh out loud before I could stop myself. Spencer asked if I'd heard about this new crypto thing, and I told him I'd look into it, which I definitely won't. What they didn't know, what they still don't know, is that 2 days after that call, we signed a pilot deal with a mid-size hospital group in the Midwest. It was our biggest contract yet. The email confirming it came through while I was on hold with a legal clerk, waiting to ask about the trust limits my children were trying to put on me. I let the whole music play, and for a moment, I just sat there smiling to myself. I stared at the screen, hardly believing what I was seeing. We were growing fast, the kind of fast that means you suddenly need more meetings, real PR help, and maybe even a proper office that doesn't smell like old carpet glue. And while all that was happening, my own kids were still trying to clip my wings, right when I was already halfway into the sky. It was almost funny. They thought I was lost and couldn't handle my own life, like I was some confused old woman who couldn't keep a household running. Meanwhile, I was managing a product team, supporting 10,000 patients, and handling a budget that made their precious trust fund look like a piggy bank you break open at Christmas. Let them watch me. Let them send letters and whisper behind my back they'd already made the one mistake you can never take back. They underestimated me. By October, our little office was starting to feel like a real company. Sure, it was still basically a cheap takeout and too much coffee, but we had something that mattered. Momentum. The hospital group in the Midwest had already rolled out our system in 2 locations, and the results were just like before. Patients waiting less time, appointments running smoother, staff finally able to breathe. Their executives were so happy they were already talking about using it everywhere. That alone felt like proof we were on to something big. But then we met with our new advisor. She was calm and sharp, the kind of person who doesn't blink even when you show them huge numbers. She looked over everything and said, almost casually, "You're on track for a 9-figure valuation if you move quickly in the next 6 months." Lacey and I looked at each other across the table like someone had just slapped us with a silk glove. It wasn't that we didn't believe it, Tit, was that we hadn't let ourselves believe it yet. We'd been so busy surviving, answering emails, fixing bugs, and trying to keep the lights on that we hadn't stopped to think that maybe, just maybe, we were about to win. But there it was, as clear as day. If we filed the right paperwork, finished the last compliance checks, and kept our results steady, we'd be ready to go public. An IPO 6 months earlier. I didn't even know what that meant. Now, it was something I actually had to wrap my head around. That night, I stayed at the office alone. I stood by the narrow window, looking out over Boston's lights glowing in the dark, and thought about Henry. He used to say, big change feels small when it happens like flipping a switch in an empty room. Before anyone else sees the light, the next few weeks were a blur. Lawyers, advisors, new hires, endless meetings with people who wanted to know everything, how the system worked, what our plans were, whether I'd stay on as the public face. That last part made me laugh. I still got nervous speaking in front of more than 4 people. I agreed to be listed as co-founder, but only on my own terms. No flashy interviews, no big headlines, just facts. We worked 12-hour days, sometimes more. Our engineering team doubled. I started wearing proper shoes again, not because anyone cared, but because I was tired of looking like I had no idea what I was doing. Then, the press started sniffing around. Someone leaked that a woman-led healthcare AI company was getting ready to go public, and reporters wouldn't leave us alone. We tried to shut the story down, but it was already spreading. One evening, Lacey asked me if I was ready. I told her I wasn't sure, but I was doing it anyway. Then came the call that changed everything. One of the big investors, the kind you read about in business magazines, wanted in early. Their bid was so high it pushed our valuation over $150 million, even before the IPO went public. I got that call while I was standing in front of the office snack cabinet, eating a stale granola bar. I almost choked. They were fully backing us. They believed in what we'd built. I didn't celebrate in any big way. I just texted Lacey, "It's happening." She sent back a string of emojis I didn't understand, followed by, "You need to tell your family." I stared at that message for a long time, my thumb hovering over the screen. She was right and wrong. My kids didn't deserve to find out about this through the news, but they hadn't earned the right to hear it first either. Still, I decided I would tell them. Just, not yet. First, there needed to be a family dinner. I wanted to let them show me, one last time, who they really thought I was. So I dug through my closet and picked out a plain black dress. I planned to drive my old car to Lucas's house, even though the company had just given me a reserved parking spot for senior leadership. I wanted them to see the version of me they'd always believed, unforgettable, small, out of place. I wanted their words to be honest, unfiltered by headlines or magazine profiles. I wanted to hear exactly what they thought they could get away with saying to me when they still believed I was nothing. The night before the dinner, I stood by the door with my keys in my hand, feeling calm in a way that surprised me. Because, this time, I wasn't walking into that house as their mother, who needed their approval. I was walking in as the woman who built something they could never even dream of. I stayed at the office late that night, going over the final stack of paperwork and emailing the signed forms back to the lawyers. Lacey and Sonia were still there too, both of them jittery and half laughing about whether we should order champagne or cheap ramen, depending on how this all turned out. I tried to act calm, but after they left, I just sat there in the dark. The whole place was quiet, and for the first time, I let myself really feel everything, the weight of it. This wasn't just about big numbers or press headlines or even the IPO. It was about every step I'd taken in secret, every small lie I'd told to protect the dream, every little victory nobody clapped for, and the simple truth, I hadn't quit. Not when the money almost ran out, not when the first clinic nearly walked away, not even when my own children tried to take away my right to make decisions for myself. I had done this. Me, Darlene Travis, a woman who used to be a high school biology teacher, who became a widow, who was always the overlooked mother in the corner. And tomorrow, I'd sit at that family table again and let them say whatever they needed to say. Then my phone would ring. The morning of the dinner, I woke up before my alarm. Not because I was nervous, just because I hadn't slept much. My head was spinning with one question. Was I ready to hear them talk about me like I wasn't even there? I got dressed slowly. I pulled on the same plain black dress I'd worn to Emily's law firm gala 2 years earlier. The one where nobody introduced me to anyone. I tied my hair back in a loose bun, because I knew they hated when I didn't make an effort. I left my Tesla parked in the company garage and dug my old Corolla out from the dusty corner where it had been sitting. I wanted them to see the version of me they always believed, in small, forgettable, out of place. I turned on public radio for the drive, just to fill the silence. The kind of silence that feels heavy with all the things you're not saying out loud. When I got to Lucas's house, nothing had changed. The same perfect lawn, the same beige walls that looked expensive in a boring way. Christine opened the door, wearing her usual fake smile. She complimented my earrings and handed me a glass of something fizzy that didn't quite taste like wine. I followed the sound of clinking glasses and polite laughter into the dining room. They were all there, already, playing their usual parts. Lucas at the head of the table telling a story like he was on Shark Tank, Emily correcting someone's grammar, Spencer scrolling his phone like a bored teenager, even though he's almost 30. They barely looked up when I walked in, a few mumbled hellos, a tight smile from Emily. Then Lucas jumped right back into bragging about some hedge fund merger. I nodded and sipped my drink. I watched them, all of them, so sure they were still in control. So sure that whatever I'd been doing these past 2 years couldn't possibly matter. Dinner was one long parade of condescending comments dressed up as friendly conversation. Emily asked if I was still volunteering and suggested I join a local board for retired women. Spencer joked that I probably didn't know what a podcast was. Lucas, always the planner, brought up some financial housekeeping we should look at while we're all here. I said nothing. I let them keep talking, keep performing, keep assuming I was the same old mom who needed their guidance. And then came the toast. Lucas stood up, raised his glass, and said, "To family where we come together, support each other, and make sure everyone's on the right path." Emily clinked her glass, nodding like she was at a funeral. Spencer added, "And to Mom finally relaxing a bit. She's earned it." I smiled, the kind of smile that feels like you're biting down on something sharp. I took a sip right as my phone started buzzing once, twice, again and again. I glanced down and saw the names: Lacey, Javier, Sonia, our compliance attorney, one of the board observers, all calling, one after another. A coordinated wave. My heart didn't pound. My hands didn't shake. I just set my glass down, stood up, and walked a few steps away to answer. "It's confirmed," Lacey said, not even waiting for me to speak. "All the signatures are in, valuations holding, the wires scheduled. It's real, Darlene. We did it. You own the majority of a platform now worth over 150 million. I closed my eyes and let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. I thanked her, ended the call, and turned back to the table. They were all staring. I walked back slowly, sat down, placed my phone face up on the table, and said, "Sorry, that was work. We just closed our final funding round. Pre-IPO valuation cleared 150. Silence, real silence, the kind that settles over a room like a fog." Lucas blinked like he didn't understand English. Emily opened her mouth, then shut it again. Spencer looked like he was about to crawl out of his own skin. I didn't rush. I took another sip and added, "So if you were about to tell me you're cutting me off financially, don't worry. You're a few months too late." Lucas was the first to recover. Of course, he was. He leaned forward with that practiced negotiation face and said, "Wait, what is this? A platform you've been, what, running like a startup?" Emily's voice was small. "Why didn't you tell us?" And Spencer, not wanting to be left out, blurted, "Is this why you weren't at Thanksgiving?" I looked at each of them, one by one, and felt the strangest sense of peace. Because for the first time, I knew exactly who I wasn't, exactly who they were too. I laughed, not in a mean way, and said, "Yes, and also because you made fun of my cranberry sauce on Instagram." Nobody laughed. The silence stretched out like an empty hallway. So I told them, in plain, steady words, exactly what I'd been doing these past 2 years. The clinics, the patient numbers, the team, the funding rounds, the pilot programs, the way we'd grown from an idea on a whiteboard to something helping real people. I didn't brag. I didn't dress it up. I didn't have to. The facts spoke louder than anything else I could have said. They tried, each in their own awkward way, to spin it around. Lucas asked if I needed help managing all that new money. Emily offered to look over my contracts. Spencer asked if I could promote his podcast on the company's social media. I just smiled and told them I'd think about it. Then I thanked them for dinner, skipped dessert, and walked out into the cool night air. I felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time, like someone had finally seen me, not as a woman who needed to be rescued or managed, but as a person who'd done something big. They'd spent the whole evening treating me like I was helpless, like I couldn't possibly understand how the world worked. And now, with one phone call and a few simple facts, the story flipped upside down. I didn't rub it in. I didn't have to, because when someone underestimates you long enough, the sweetest revenge isn't yelling or proving them wrong with words. It's success so clear, you don't have to explain it. That night, I didn't owe them anything more. When I got home, I'd already missed 6 calls and over 20 texts, mostly from people who hadn't reached out to me in months, people suddenly remembering they had my number. I didn't answer any of them. Instead, I poured a glass of wine, kicked off the shoes I'd worn just to blend in, and sat at my kitchen table. I opened my laptop to the company dashboard and watched the numbers tick up with new clinic signups. Fresh data coming in. A message from a hospital in Colorado asking about a partnership. It was calming, like listening to rain tapping on the roof after a long storm. I slept better that night than I had in weeks. But morning always brings reality. Lucas called first, his voice too casual, too rehearsed. He asked if I wanted to have lunch. Just the two of us, no pressure. Which would have sounded innocent if I hadn't heard him use that same voice 100 times, like when he needed Dad to co-sign something or cover one of his old debts. I told him I was busy. Sure, he said, trying to sound unbothered. Maybe next week. Then Emily emailed me. The subject line read, "Proud of you." It was a weirdly cheerful message, full of compliments and an offer to connect me with someone at her firm who specializes in healthcare, intellectual property, and corporate transitions. It took me 3 tries to read it because I kept laughing at how quickly she'd changed her tune. Next came Spencer's text. No punctuation, just, "Yo, can I pitch you something?" 5-min call. I didn't reply to any of them. I didn't need to. They'd shown me who they were at dinner, ready to cut me off, ready to treat me like a burden, and then scrambling to grab hold the second I had something worth their time. I wasn't angry. I wish I could say I was, but the truth, it just felt predictable, like turning over the last card in a game you'd already figured out. The only thing that surprised me was the package waiting on my porch that afternoon. No note, just a shiny binder with a ribbon and Emily's law firm's logo on the cover. Inside, it was filled with papers labeled Family Reintegration Investment Strategy. I flipped through it slowly. Each page was more ridiculous than the last. A proposal for how the family trust could strategically participate in my company. A pitch deck template for Spencer's podcast, now suddenly rebranded as a mental health startup. Even a 1-page note suggesting possible speaking gigs for me women's business conferences, and a polite hint about refreshing my wardrobe to fit the brand. I stared at the whole thing for a long minute. Then, I tucked it in a bag with the junk mail and fed it straight into the shredder. That night, I logged into our donation system and quietly transferred the deed to the old family vacation cottage, one they'd recently kicked me out of, into a nonprofit's name. It was going to be a rehab and retreat center for women veterans. The legal work had been ready for weeks, just in case. I clicked submit, let out a long breath, and watched the confirmation message pop up on the screen. They could keep their trust fund games. I was building something that actually gave people peace. The next morning, I was at a little coffee shop near the office. Sonia and Javier were debating whether our app needed brighter colors. I was half listening, half skimming new clinic proposals. I was mid-sip when Lacey leaned over and said with a grin, "You know, Forbes called again, right?" I nodded. "Tell them, I'll talk after launch, not before." She raised her eyebrows but didn't push it. She understood. This wasn't about headlines or applause. It was about finishing what we'd started. Still, there was one email I did answer that day. A young woman from one of our earliest clinics had written me a short note. "I'm applying to nursing school because of what your platform did for my dad. Just wanted to say thank you." I sat there a long time, staring at the screen, before typing back, "You're the reason we built it. Thank you for letting us help." That moment meant more to me than anything in Emily's fancy binder ever could. Later that night, when I locked up the office and walked my old Corolla, yes, still hanging on, I caught myself smiling. Not because everything was perfect, but because, finally, everything was mine. My choices, my timing, my work, my values. They had tried so hard to manage me into disappearing. Instead, I turned all that silence into something strong, something lasting. I knew the media would catch up soon. I knew the story would spread. And I knew my kids would probably spin some new version of events, how they always believed in me, how they always supported my mission, how they always knew I could do this. Let them post, tag, and throw events in my name. I wasn't going to stop them, but I wasn't going to stand next to them, either. Not unless they earned it. Not with a few nice words, but with real actions. That was the new rule. Quiet effort, real work, no shortcuts. That's what built this. And if they wanted a seat at the table, they'd have to build their own damn chair. I didn't jump to say yes to the interview, even though I knew it was coming. The minute our valuation went public and the employee shares crossed a certain number, I knew reporters would come sniffing around, especially the ones who love a tidy story. Overlooked mom defies the odds, builds healthcare tech, gets rich, teaches everyone a lesson. But it wasn't a lesson, not really. And it wasn't about proving anyone wrong, no matter how it looked from the outside. Still, when the journalist emailed the calm, older woman with direct questions and no fluffy agreed, but only if we could meet at the office. No staged backdrops. No expensive lighting. Just the real place, with secondhand chairs and whiteboards stained from too many late nights. She showed up early. She wore flats. She didn't bother with small talk. "Why, didn't you tell anyone what you were building?" she asked right away. I paused, looked around at the team trickling in behind the glass doors, and said, "Because I didn't want to spend half my energy defending it before it even existed." She nodded like she understood, and from there the conversation just flowed. No drama, no big performance, just honesty. I told her about Henry's notes, how it started in my garage, how I had to Google half the words at first and pretended to know what I was doing until I finally did. She tried to get me to talk about my kids by name. I could tell she was hoping I'd spill, but I didn't. When she asked gently, "Any regrets?" I told her no, because every hard moment, every dismissive look, every time someone treated me like an inconvenience instead of a person with something to offer, all of it fed the stubborn streak that built this place. The article came out the next week. Simple headline. A clean, black and white photo. And one quote in big letters. I wasn't waiting to be noticed. I was building something worth seeing. I didn't post it. I didn't retweet it. But by noon, my inbox was overflowing. Old colleagues from the school where I used to teach sent kind notes. A student I hadn't seen in 20 years emailed to say I'd inspired her to apply to MIT. My old principal sent flowers. That one made me cry, just a little, in the hallway by the elevator where nobody could see. Meanwhile, Lucas texted a screenshot of the article. "This is huge, we should talk." Emily emailed again. Subject line, incredible. This time, no offers, no strategies. Just, proud of you, even if I didn't say it when I should have. Spencer posted the article online with the caption, "My mom, the goat." I rolled my eyes so hard I nearly dropped my phone. But I didn't write back to any of them. I wasn't angry anymore, just clear. They were watching now, and that was fine. But I wasn't here to perform for them. Instead, I went back to the clinic, where we'd run our very first pilot. I called ahead, kept it quiet, and showed up on a random Tuesday with a big box of coffee and a stack of handwritten thank you notes for the staff. The receptionist barely recognized me, but she smiled at me like I was someone who mattered. Walked the halls where it all began. I saw one of our old modules running on a dusty computer screen. I watched a nurse click through it like it had always been there. For the first time in months, I felt grounded, not successful, not validated, just present, just useful. That night, I sat in my living room with a bowl of soup and a folder of papers from our nonprofit branch. I read grant proposals from small towns asking for help funding, training, better access. These weren't vanity projects. These were people's lives. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I heard Henry's voice steady, teasing, "I told you, you'd get it eventually." I didn't need magazine features, flowers, or follow-up calls. I just needed that. The quiet knowledge that we hadn't built something flashy or temporary. We'd built something real. Something that, even if my kids never understood it, heaven, if they kept circling the edges, unsure how to feel, would outlast all the smallness of their doubts. The next morning, I called Lacey and said, "Let's triple the pilot applications for next quarter." She paused and said, "We're going national, aren't we?" I said, "Not yet, but we're ready now, if we want to be." And for the first time since this all began, I said it without hesitation. We were ready. I was ready. I wasn't hiding anymore. I wasn't explaining or justifying. I was just moving forward. 6 months after the IPO, I hosted a dinner of my own, not at a country club or a big estate, but on the rooftop of a simple event space downtown. It had mismatched chairs and string lights that made everything look softer, more human. It wasn't meant to be a show. It was just a thank you gathering for the people who built this with me, the engineers who kept coding even when they were sick, The operations manager who turned my messy binder of clinic contacts into something that actually worked. The advisor who believed in us before there were any numbers. And Lacey, who showed up carrying 3 tote bags full of homemade cookies because she still didn't trust caterers. I invited my kids to, not because I owed them anything, but because I wanted them to see it for themselves what I'd built, who I'd become, and what they'd missed while they were busy managing their assumptions. Lucas came first, wearing a blazer, and that look he gets when he's preparing to negotiate. He brought Christine, who stayed mostly quiet. Emily came alone, stiff but polite, handing me a bottle of wine I didn't recognize. Spencer was late, as usual, with an expensive haircut and an attempt at humility that mostly involved standing by the cheese plate looking thoughtful. I greeted them all like you'd greet distant relatives at a wedding, warm enough to be civil, cool enough to remind them that being family didn't automatically make us close. Dinner was Buffett style, relaxed, full of small conversations about real work, user feedback, hiring problems, our plans to expand. Not the shallow small talk I used to sit through at their parties. My kids were clearly out of their depth. Lucas kept asking about strategic partnerships. Emily cornered Sonia about legal stuff. Spencer tried to take a selfie with our lead developer, who just looked confused. I didn't rush to rescue them. They could watch or not. It wasn't about them anymore. Halfway through, I stood up to say a few words, not because I wanted attention, but because I needed to thank the people who'd shown up when it counted. I raised my glass. To the team, I said, who made every late night and impossible ask feel like something we could handle. And to the idea itself, this stubborn thing that refused to die. I paused. We built something real, not for the stock price, not for the optics, because it matters. I didn't look at my kids while I said it. I didn't need to. After dessert, Lucas asked if we could talk privately. We stepped to the side, near the edge of the rooftop. He said, I was wrong. We were all wrong. I didn't realize you'd built something this big. I nodded. Let the silence hang there. Then I said, it's not about how big it is, it's about the impact. That's what you never asked about. He nodded. And to his credit, he didn't try to pitch me anything. Emily came over next. She looked a little guarded. She said she was sorry for how everything had happened and that maybe she'd been too quick to judge. Maybe, I said. And we both smiled small, a little sad. Spencer didn't say much. He just hugged me on his way out and mumbled, proud of you, Mom. Like it was something he'd practiced in his head and wasn't sure how to say. I let it land. It wasn't everything, but it wasn't nothing either. The next morning, I went back to the office before sunrise. The city was still waking up. I unlocked the door, made a pot of terrible coffee, and sat in the quiet, watching the lights start to spill over the rooftops. I opened my laptop and looked at our live dashboard. 20 new clinics signed up this month to pilot expansions. 1 inquiry from a UK hospital system. The foundation I started had already funded 6 scholarships for young women learning to code, with more on the way. I thought about all the times I almost gave up, not because I doubted the mission, but because carrying other people's disbelief is heavy, heavier than most people will ever admit. I thought about the girl who'd emailed me after reading that interview. She wrote, "My family doesn't believe in me either, but maybe I don't need them to yet." That, more than any valuation or headline, was what stayed with me. It wasn't about winning. It was about making space for someone else to try. That family dinner where they tried to cut me off, they thought it would shrink me down, make me smaller, remind me of my limits. Instead, it cleared the air. It gave me the final push to step into my own life without apology. And now, sitting there with a full inbox and a full heart, I could finally say it, not out of bitterness or resentment, just quiet truth. I never needed their permission. Just a clear view of what I was capable of when no one else was watching. And I had never felt more seen. That's today's story. If it touched you, leave a like and subscribe. And don't forget, share your own life lesson in the comments below.